Welcome to the second part of the lectures about ethics and usability. A quick review of what we talked about in part 1. We talked about the definition of ethics. We talked about a few major ethical systems that you can use when you're evaluating ethical issues. We talked about what the U.S. government has to say about ethics and usability testing. And we also talked about the characteristics of an ethical usability test. Let's review some of those characteristics of an ethical usability test because they feed into what we're talking about today. So in particular, we have to have minimal risk. We have to have the right to withdraw, so the participant can take off at any time. The participant also has the right to withdraw their own data. The participant has the right to confidentiality. You need to keep their identity shielded. You can't deceive the participant. And now you can deceive them a little bit, but it's a slippery slope and it's very difficult to discuss. So I would suggest try not to deceive them at all unless you will get somehow skewed results. And even then, see if you can figure out a way to construct the study so you don't have to deceive them. And then we need informed consent. Informed consent has to be done orally in the pre-test procedures and in writing in the consent form. Let's discuss informed consent. What is it? It's an exchange of information. It goes between the researcher and the participant. It requires two things. The researcher needs to inform the participant what that participant is going to do during the test and any potential consequences that the user will encounter. The participant has to understand these ideas, and that person has to be able to make an informed decision about participating because they want to, not because they have to. So why is this informed consent thing, why do we need to talk about it so much? Well, a couple of reasons. One, it's absolutely and totally and 100% undoubtedly mandatory. If you skip informed consent, it's ethically problematic at the very least, and also you're probably asking for legal trouble. So make sure you get informed consent. We're going to talk about how to provide it later, but for the moment, we're going to talk about what information you need to provide both orally and in your written consent form. I'm going to provide a fairly long list of ideas. Make sure you get all the elements in this list. And although covering them may seem like a lot of work, like, oh, I've got to talk about all of these things, it's really not that bad. It gets easier. The first couple of times you do it, it's a pain, but then you can start to recycle your material. A lot of what you'll create is boilerplate that you can move from one study to another. And also, as you go along, you'll discover that, just even if you have to write it from scratch, oh, I've done this before, it gets a lot easier. So let's talk about what informed consent you have to, what information is required for informed consent. At the very least, you need a statement that the study involves research. Now, your participants are not lab rats. This cute little guy right here, this is not your participant. You cannot just do things to them. So when you're talking about working with people, you have to make sure that they know what's going on. That's particularly important because sometimes this doesn't happen so much in usability, but in other types of research, people don't realize that, oh, I was part of a study? What? And they didn't realize that something like that was happening and that they were receiving experimental treatment of some kind. This wasn't the real thing. I got a placebo. Again, that's not so much a problem in usability, but whenever we're doing research, we always need to state that the study involves research. We need to provide some descriptions. You need to tell the user what is the study's purpose and what are the study's procedures. For example, I'm just going to spitball this here. This is not verbatim that you can put in your text, but something like the study's purpose is to test the new Widget Master 5000 and see how it operates when real people are trying to use it. We are going to provide you with materials you need and instructions to perform a task. Please try to follow them. If you succeed, great. If you don't, that's a problem with the machine and not you. So we're talking about what are we doing with the study and how are we going to do it. You can be more or less specific as need be, but generally speaking, that sort of broad outlines I gave you will do. Why do we do this? Well, it's because there was some really interesting but kind of unethical research that went on in the past. You may have heard of the Milgram experiments. I'm going to talk about this briefly. Basically, this is a famous experiment to find out if people will obey orders even if those orders go against their moral beliefs or their good judgment. So this experimenter set up a situation with three people. They had the experimenter, they had the subject, and those people are in the same room, and then behind a screen they had a confederate, a fake test subject. The experimenter told the subject, the participant, to ask the fake test subject questions. Every time the fake test participant got it wrong, the research participant would then hit a switch and supposedly deliver an electric shock. And these electric shocks got stronger and stronger and stronger over time. By the end of the test, they would be lethal. So the experimenter would keep urging the research participant who didn't know what's going on, yes, give him the shock, give him the shock, give him the shock. And this is an actual picture from some of the tests. The guy screaming there is the confederate who is faking it, but all the same, the guy on the left there, who's just kind of looking stony-faced, he's the one who doesn't know what's going on. So we always need to tell people what is the purpose of the study and how is it going to work, because we want to avoid traumatizing people. We want to explain how is the session going to be recorded. If you're going to take video, tell them you're going to take video. If you're going to take audio, you're going to tell them you're going to take audio. If you're going to do eye tracking, make sure you tell them that. If you're going to do screen captures, tell them that. The thing is, people have a right to know how they are being observed. You have to provide also a statement of how long the session is expected to last. So perhaps the participants, they might have ice cream waiting in the car, or they may have an appointment. They need to go pick up the kids at daycare. Whatever it may be, you always have to let them know how long are they probably going to be around, because you don't want them feeling like they are trapped. You can't do that to people. You need to describe any risks the people will encounter. In your student research, we want to keep this as low risk as possible. Now, when you get out into the quote-unquote real world and start working in an industry, you may run into some more higher risk areas. But at the same time, I always suggest try to keep it as low risk as possible. You don't want to hurt people. Any risk that is physical, let them know. And are there any psychological risks? Is there any possible risk to their social standing? Could they lose money somehow? Could they, if their identities got out, could they be hurt? Could there be some sort of legal repercussions? This isn't so much a big deal in usability studies, but let's say that you're doing research and asking people about their habits of illegal drug use. Well, gee, there could be some legal repercussions there, particularly if confidentiality is broken. They could possibly lose social status. They might even lose their jobs. So you got to be very careful when you're talking about what kind of risk is involved. Make sure you list it and try to keep your research as low risk as possible. Sometimes you need to describe what benefit the research participants are going to get. Generally speaking, usability test participants, they get paid. We'll talk more about that later at the end of this presentation. But the thing is, if you're going to pay them, you need to be concrete, not vague, about how you will pay them. For example, you will receive $50 for your participation. That's not uncommon. When we're talking about other types of research, not so much usability, sometimes the benefits are more vague. For example, researchers might claim that participants will come away from the test session feeling better about themselves. Well, really? How can you tell? Is that really the case? Is that going to happen for sure? That's vague anyway. So if you can't tell for sure, it's often best to say there are no direct benefits to participants. In terms of usability testing, though, you usually want to specify that you will receive this for your participation. You need to provide a statement of how the data and results will be used. For example, sometimes, let's say you're doing a usability test on an interface of some kind. You want to improve it. So you need to tell the participants that we're going to take the data and we are going to share it with our programmers, and then we are going to take the suggestions people have provided, incorporate them into the program, and use those when we release it to the public. Okay, fair enough. But what if you all didn't say that, oh yes, we're also going to take the videos that we took of you and we're going to put them up on our corporate website? That might be a bit of a problem, wouldn't it? So when talking informed consent, your users, your research participants, always need to know how are you going to use the data and what are you going to do with it. You need to describe the confidentiality procedures you'd follow. As we've learned from watching the news, you have to take good care of things that are supposed to be secret. For example, people's identities. So instead of running into troubles like this, what we want to do is we want to keep our information under lock and key. Now that can be literal lock and key, or it can be virtual. What we need to do at the very least is shield names. So we need to replace names with numbers, aliases perhaps. You need to know how is the data being stored. In the example we see here, it's in a locked file. It's probably also in a locked drawer. When I'm doing research, for example, as a professor, and I have to fill out information for the institutional review board and say that, well, here's how I'm going to do my research, I often have to say, yeah, I'm going to keep all the research. I'm going to keep it in a locked drawer in my locked office. Sometimes you also need to specify when you'll destroy the data, particularly if it has to do with sensitive personal information. You need to include a statement that participation in the study is voluntary. People who are participating because they have to, it's never a good idea because, well, if they're being forced, your results aren't going to be good, and it's also unethical to make them, force them to follow along and use this. A statement that the participant has the right to quit at any time and also withdraw their data is vital. Remember, you cannot keep people prisoner. If they've decided at any point, yeah, I'm done with this, you just have to let them go. Similarly, if they want to withdraw their data at any point, whether it's at the very beginning of the study, after the study, they could call you later and say, you know, I've thought about this and I don't really feel comfortable. Can you pull my data out? You have to say yes, because they are research participants. They are not subjects. They are working with you, and as human beings, they have the right to their own data. You need to include a statement about the product that's being tested, not the user. So this idea is important. I'm going to repeat it. The product is being tested, not the user. You need to specify this because sometimes people will feel, well, nervous or bad if they fail at a test. They'll think, oh no, I failed. That's not the case. Always emphasize you are testing the product, not the user. You need to include a statement about that the person running the test has no preference in the outcome of it. So if a manager who has power over the project is running the test, oh gee, is that really disinterested? No, it's not. Is the designer who is running the test? Oh no, my baby, you're telling me my baby is ugly? Well, that's not good. So you always want to have somebody who is running the test who doesn't have a stake in the outcome. Sometimes you will have things we call vulnerable populations. What is a vulnerable population? It's a minor, a prisoner, somebody who can't make decisions well, somebody who doesn't have a lot of education, and somebody who doesn't have a lot of money. These are all people who are vulnerable according to a federal government rule. So minors, why are they vulnerable? Well, kids often do what adults tell them to, even if it's not in their best interests. Prisoners, they are subject to being told what to do all the time. They don't have the right to refuse. Somebody who has impaired decision-making capacity, if they're mentally disabled or somehow ill and can't make a good decision, you can take advantage of them very easily. Similarly, people who are not well-schooled, they could be fooled by big words. People who are poor, you can manipulate them because you have money, they don't, and they'll do things for money. For the purposes of usability testing, we're going to extend this a little bit also to students and employees. Students, because they're often, their grades can depend on participating or not, and employees, because their status at a company can be influenced by whether they participate or their answers when they participate. So when we talk about vulnerable populations, they are people who are vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. So when we're talking about this, if there is a vulnerable population in your sample of participants, explain how are you protecting them. The big deal here is you can't play puppet master. You need to include contact information for both the researcher or researchers who are working on the study, and if you are working at a university, include the IRB, the Institutional Review Board information. At Kennesaw, you can find that at research.kennesaw.edu/IRB/contact.php. You may have to make sure that you do not, repeat, not waive people's rights. They do not give away their rights by signing the form that says I'm going to participate. A waiver, in case you're wondering, is a removal of responsibility or cost that would normally apply. In other words, people, if they sign a waiver, they are losing their rights, or you are no longer covered by the responsibility that the people have signed away. So we can't do that. Make sure you include a statement of the age groups that are included in the participant sample. If there aren't any minors, and please, 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 no kids, nobody below 18, then use a variation on the phrase I'll give you here. All participants must be at least 18 years old. Why is that? It's because if you work with 18 or 17 and below, you're working with vulnerable populations, and there are a whole lot of rules you have to follow to make sure that you're not exploiting them. You need to include a statement about collecting IP addresses if your research study is an online survey. If you don't know what an IP address is, essentially it is an identifying number that is attached to a computer. So potentially, if you get somebody's IP address, you can track them down to their home. So therefore, if your survey is confidential, you can collect them, but you got to keep them under close wraps. If your survey is anonymous, on the other hand, you cannot collect them because you would be breaking anonymity. In either case, I suggest that you try to avoid collecting IP addresses unless you absolutely must have them, but even then, try to figure out a way that you can avoid getting them. If your study involves more than minimal risk, which really shouldn't apply to student work, we want to keep this as low risk as possible, you have to provide a couple of things. One, emergency contact information in case someone gets hurt. You have to include a statement of how you will compensate and or treat somebody if they get injured. And you also have to specify the procedures for storing data and destroying data. Now, again, the procedures for storing and destroying data, we've already talked about that a little bit, but if there's more than minimal risk, you have to really go into detail about exactly what it is you're going to do to make sure that absolutely no information leaks out. It's also come to my attention that sometimes students at Kennesaw don't know where to go in the case of an emergency. So, the campus cops, they are available at 470-578, that's KSU, 6666. If you haven't done so already, I suggest programming this into your phone. If you call 911 from on campus, you will be transferred to a county office, and then they have to play phone tag with the KSU police. It'll delay things a lot, so if you have trouble on campus, again, 470-578-6666. If your participants in your research study are students, you have to provide alternatives to participating, especially if the participation is for class credit, you have to give them some other way out. They don't feel comfortable, they are not physically able, they are not mentally able, they have a religious objection perhaps. Who knows what it is, but people have reasons for not participating. It could have a negative effect on their lives and their grades. So we can't coerce people into participating. Also, If the case is that the instructor is the one who is running the test, you have to make an arrangement for somebody who is not the instructor to run those test sessions because, well, yeah, it could be a bad thing. Almost done. Almost done. Hang in there. We're almost done. These participants that you have then, well, where did you get them from? How did you recruit them? We're going to talk about specific techniques for recruiting some other time, but the thing I want to get at here right now is, generally speaking, you gotta pay people in order to have them participate. Most people, they need some kind of payoff, otherwise they just are not going to do it. The people who will participate without being paid are, well, often ones who can be manipulated, so we can't have that. We gotta have people who are coming in of their own free will. Well, if they're coming in for their own free will and we're going to pay them, how does that work out? Well, the ethics of it, you have to provide the incentive that is based on a real risk and a real benefit. So if something is very risky and you're giving a very low incentive, you aren't going to get many people, and also it's just out of line. So you have to ramp up the payment as the risk gets higher. Similarly, if there's a really great benefit out of this, you may not have to pay them as much. But either way, don't recruit people through giving huge payoffs. If the only way you're going to get people is by paying them exorbitant amounts, then you're running into trouble because that's undue influence or coercion. Wow, I normally wouldn't do this, but they're throwing so much money at me, I can't afford not to participate. Well, in that case, they're probably going to tell you whatever it is that you want to know. And they'll try to give you the answer you like because you're giving them lots of money. That's a bad thing. You also need to follow the tax laws. If you're giving a very large amount of money, you'll have to report it to the IRS. You also need to keep records. If you're paying out money, or if you're giving something of a significant amount of value, then, yeah, you got to keep a record. Now, if you're giving something away like KSU swag, like, here's I don't know, here is something, a pencil or a pen. Thank you for participating in our usability test. Here's a pen that I got from the KSU store. Well, okay, that's nice. It's only going to cost you 50 cents. That's not a big deal. But if it costs you $5, yes, you need to keep records of how much you actually spent, because otherwise it could be considered that you are somehow embezzling, and you have to make sure that your money is going where it is intended to go. And then specify how people will get paid and when they will get paid. Include this information in the sign-off sheet, because people will be, you need to be ethical about, again, how much are you going to pay them? Oh yes, you'll be paid handsomely, and then you give them $1. Is that really good? No. Then when are they going to get paid? Oh yes, totally, I'm going to pay you. And then people wait, and people wait, and people wait. Specify when they get paid. That's part 2 of ethics and usability. So what did we learn? We talked about the definition of informed consent. We talked about information researchers need to provide. We talked about what vulnerable populations are, who is in those vulnerable populations, and we also talked about rules for paying participants ethically. That's the end of the video lecture. Thank you very much.